I'm Aaron Sawatsky-Kingsley. I'm here today on behalf of the Department of Environmental Resilience. Teresa Saylor is in the background helping to make sure that all of our technology works. And we're also here with AJ Delgadillo, who I've gotten to know just a little bit over the past couple months. He's going to speak to us today about vermiculture and vermicomposting, that is composting with worms. AJ has a degree from Goshen College in peace and justice and conflict studies, and he's putting it to great use in this particular application. And depending on how our conversation goes, or our presentation this morning, maybe we'll hear a little bit more from him about how that all fits together. But at any rate, AJ has been living and working here in Goshen for several years, and this is one of the things that he is really into, and I think there's a lot of value for all of us here in Goshen, those of us who are beginning to think more and more about gardening, those of us who are interested in helping to reduce the amount of solid waste that we produce, those of us who are concerned about greenhouse gas emissions that we also produce. So this, I think, is a really timely presentation, and I think I'll stop talking and let AJ do the rest of it here. So AJ, it's yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is my worm farm. All of these bins behind me are filled with worms that I use for composting. I have 26 bins, and I can compost about 60 pounds a week. My name is AJ, and I've been here for a few years. I started worm composting after graduation. I got a job putting to use all the things that I learned. And I was like, great, this is what I wanted to do. This is so exciting. And then I realized that I was doing what I learned to do, but I also had a love for learning that I was sort of setting down. And so I got really into like watching TED Talks and educational YouTube videos. And I came across a video of somebody being zero waste and sort of that whole journey and that life. And I was like, holy cow, I can't do that. But if somebody can be zero waste, I can certainly do better. So with that, I started looking into ways that I could reduce my waste, knowing that I did not have the resources to become zero waste. And I was able to pretty easily come up with the idea of more effectively composting. And so when I was thinking about different ways of composting, I wanted to do something that would compost stuff quickly so I could get it offhand, and then something that would be composted effectively. I've sort of seen a number of people who had piles that just sort of sat forever and never really turned into anything, and that wasn't really appealing to me. And so wanting something that moved quickly and was composted effectively, I came across composting with worms. And so I started doing that at home. And then one day at work, I saw that after lunch, a lot of what was in the trash was the insides of peppers, banana peels, apple cores. And I was like, oh, well, if I can compost at home, I can also compost at work. So I brought the worms to work, and I started composting there for my coworkers. And then the bin slowly filled up with food, and then the worms ate that, and that slowly filled up with worm poop. And I was like, oh, I need to empty this and collect the worm castings. So I took the worms home, emptied out the castings, took the worms back, started collecting food. And the second time it filled up, I was like, I don't have the energy to carry all these worms back and forth. So what I ended up doing was keeping the worms at home, where I could keep an eye on them all the time, but then moving the food waste from work to home. And then I was like, okay, this is working great. And then it dawned on me, if I can do this for myself and for my coworkers at work, I can also do this for an elderly friend and for my neighbors. So I started doing it for them. And then it dawned on me, if I can do it for those folks, transporting the food scraps back and forth, I could open that up and do it for everyone. And so I started a community compost service, and that has really been the central focus of my worm farm until now. Well, it still is, but that has been the focus of my worm farm. And so the presentation I have prepared today is to sort of explain a little bit of what I do and also to explain it in case you wanted to do it at home. Aaron, at this point, do you have any questions, or should I get going?
I think why don't you just go ahead and jump into it? And if any questions come to me as we're going along, I may stop you. It may be that some questions come up, but for the most part, I think we'll let you just kind of work through your presentation, and then maybe there'll be a little time at the end for some
Alrighty.
questions too. Great.
Oh, are you seeing my bottom bar of icons on the shared screen?
I'm not.
Okay.
No.
Great.
Nope. Go ahead.
So, with composting, I have found out that there are people who don't believe it's worthwhile. And so there's three main arguments for why we should compost that I think really stick out. One is for the soil. Soil, as different from dirt, like dirt is the grime you get after being outside. Soil is the thing that plants live out of. And soil is this living mixture of minerals, organic matter, and microbes that is dynamic and changing, and it's alive. And it needs, as any living thing, it needs to eat. So you need to be feeding it organic matter. And outside, there's always like dead leaves and whatnot falling down to the forest floor, getting broken down and transformed in this continuous process. When you look at our gardens or our houseplants, more importantly, like that doesn't happen. If there's not organic matter, if we're not putting the organic matter there, it's not going to be there. So it's important to put organic matter there, and compost is the easiest, most logical thing to do for that. The second argument is economic. There is value trapped in your food waste, and good compost comes at a premium, and when you're throwing out your food waste, you're throwing out that value. And then the third one is environmental. 4.5 pounds of solid municipal waste go to the landfill per person per day. And 60% of that is compostable. That does overlap. Some of that that's counted as compostable is paper stuff, so it could also, a part of that could be recycled, but 60% of solid municipal waste is compostable, which means that it doesn't need to be there. 60% of our landfills don't need to be there. And I think that that's just a wild statistic to keep in mind. How much further we would be if we just composted everything that could be, and then we would free up space to start thinking about what else we could reduce after that. So those are the three arguments that I think are the most critical about why we need to be composting. Biomimicry is sort of like the central principle of composting. According to the Biomimicry Institute, biomimicry is an approach to innovation that seeks sustainable solutions to human challenges by emulating nature's time-tested patterns and strategies. And I think that definition is really boring, so I made my own. We've built for ourselves a world with lots of problems, and more than that, we've forgotten solutions. Biomimicry means looking to nature for solutions before we try something more complicated and less effective. We have so many solutions that we've just over-engineered that don't really work quite as well. I think a lot of times if we just look to what happened before we threw things out of balance, we can find solutions to our problems. And so to the problem of food waste, out in nature, everything gets broken down and transformed and reused. And so to do that, there's this team effort between insects and fungus and bacteria and worms. And so no one wants to like have a bunch of gross mold spewing spores into the air, or have like a swarm of flies. And so we want to take a little bit of what nature does and use like the cleanest or most comfortable aspects of that and bring that indoors. And so using worms is a really effective, quick, odorless way of transforming our food waste into worm castings and turning it into something new without bringing in some of those things that we don't want in our house, like fungus and bugs. So the main points that we're going to hit is the kinds of worms you can use for indoor composting, what to do with bedding, how to feed, how to manage moisture, and then what to do when things go wrong, mostly if you have acid, smell, or bugs. And then the last part is collecting the castings. Oh, come now. So there's three main kinds of worms that are raised for composting. There's Acenia fetida, red wigglers. That is what I use. They eat 50% of their body weight a day, and they do well in 40 to 85 degrees. That was one of the most critical points to me. I wanted to, so like I said, I was trying to reduce my waste. And so a part of waste is not just the solid stuff that we produce, but how much carbon dioxide are we letting out because of our actions. And if I needed something that needed to be 70 degrees all the time or warmer, I was going to need to heat it because Indiana doesn't stay 70 degrees year round. But a basement will stay somewhere between 40 and 85 degrees. So as long as I keep the bins in a basement, they'll be at the right temperature and they can be temperature controlled passively. Another one that's good for composting is the African nightcrawler. They can eat 150 times their body weight a day. And so that is, if you're trying to get through a lot quickly, they're much more effective at that, but they do need to be heated. And then European nightcrawlers are just a little bit warmer in the range that they're in, 60 to 70 degrees. So if you have a warm place to keep them that's warm year round, that'll work just fine. But they do eat even slower than the red wigglers. There are worm farmers out there who will collect like wild worms and throw them in their worm bins. That is a strategy that I've seen. I don't know the stats on how fast wild worms would eat or what conditions they're in, which is why I would encourage you to find like a specific species of worms to use for that, just so that you can better understand their needs and better understand at what rate they're going to eat. And then bedding is going to be the first part of setting up your bin. The bedding is going to be the brown part of the compost. A lot of people, when they look into instructions on composting, things will be divided into greens and browns, and bedding is the brown part. And so that's high in carbon, and that helps balance out the worm's diet. As far as keeping the bin under control, having the browns there will help regulate moisture because they'll hold onto it longer than greens. And so it's easier, it makes it a more stable moisture so that if it's dry, you can add it moisture more incrementally. The problem then is if it's wet, it'll let go of it more incrementally as well. And then the browns, being high in carbon, have longer and firmer carbon chains in them, and so that'll give the castings their structure. If you think about something rough, breaking down is still going to be rough. But if you think about like a banana peel breaking down, you're just going to get mush, and you don't really want mush for your castings or for your soil. So what can you make your bedding out of? Brown cardboard is great. As much as I don't want to plug Amazon, Amazon boxes work just fine. And I say that as opposed to like cereal boxes. The amount that they're processed and waxed will not break down well, and the worms won't like it. So just standard brown corrugated cardboard is fine. Newsprint works great. You do need to shred it up a bit first. You don't need to like run it through a paper shredder, but like just to not be throwing in your whole newspaper at once. And it's important not to use glossy print. And I do have a bone to pick with glossy print. It can't be recycled. It can't be composted. We should not make things that cannot be broken down in any way. So say no to glossy print. And then what I use a lot of is ground coconut shell and sawdust. I blend the ground coconut shell, the sawdust, and coffee chaff together to create, oh boy, I don't think I have a great way of showing you. I'll grab a scoop of it. to create this stuff. It actually smells a lot like coffee because of the coffee chaff, which is this sort of covering around the coffee bean. I made this blend because it approximates the physical and chemical properties of peat moss. A lot of worm farms use peat moss. It is easy to get. It has this the long carbon chains in it that help give structure. It helps regulate moisture. And peat moss renews at a geological timescale. It grows back a fraction of an inch a year, as opposed to sawdust or coconut shell, which do renew at a human timescale.
Hey, AJ.
Yeah.
Let me break in. If you stop sharing your screen for a moment, you could show us that bowl.
Oh, you couldn't see that?
I mean, we could. It was just a little thumbnail. But stop sharing your screen for a moment, and then put it back up there, and then I think we can. Yeah, now put it. Yeah. Oh, that looks good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
So there's three ingredients there. There's the ground coconut shell, the sawdust, and the coffee silver skin.
So while I'm interrupting, where do you source those kinds of ingredients?
The sawdust I get from a local woodworker. And so it is, I mean, you can buy, I think, compacted hardwood sawdust, but I get mine from a source that it's a waste product of. And so I just make sure that there's not anything toxic put in. You want to, if you're using it as a part of your bedding, you want to make sure that the wood hasn't been treated chemically or pressure treated,
Right.
or else it will be toxic. You also want to make sure it's not walnut, because walnut wood will kill your worms.
Right. Okay.
And so I went over that with this guy, and he said that he doesn't do any of those things. So it was perfect. The coffee chaff I get from the brew here in Goshen. I hope they open up soon. I'm almost out. I hope they open up when it is safe to do so. I'm not trying to be reckless. But they take the chaff off their own coffee beans, and so they have this naturally occurring byproduct that renews at the human timescale. And then I use ground coconut coir, which you can get from almost any garden shop. It's the only ingredient that I buy, and it's grown, but no one grows coconuts for the shell. You grow it for the fruit inside. So it's still a byproduct, which was really important to me because I wanted to make sure everything going into the bins was a waste product or a byproduct of some kind. But if
that's great. That's great.
Yeah, that process was pretty painstaking. I don't think everyone needs to quite do all that work, and having smaller grounds like this really matters most if you're doing vermicomposting. If you're doing composting outdoors, you can use larger browns like sticks and the cardboard. And then worm food. This page is actually a little bit deceitful. When we think about bedding and food, those are terms that people think about. Those aren't the terms that worms think about, because worms are going to eat it all. So it's all food to them. So when I say worm food, what I mean is things that we as humans would consider food. So that'll be our food scraps. And then if you're used to discourse around composting, this is going to be your greens as opposed to your browns. And really, most plant materials can go. It's actually easier to think about what can't go, because almost anything that grows can go. So you want to avoid your 3 S's, things that spoil. And that's going to be things that go bad before the worms can eat them. So that'll be meat, dairy, bread, grease, or anything that's been cooked with them. So if you have a salad and then you put like dressing on it, you've now introduced grease, and that can't be composted anymore. But if you did just have a vegetable salad with some veggies, other veggies like thrown in there, You could throw what you don't eat into your compost just fine, as long as you haven't introduced like a source of oil. Then there's things that are sour or acid. That'll be like lemon, lime, or pineapple. If things get too sour, it will actually erode the skin of the worms and put them in a lot of pain, if not kill them. So we need to avoid that. And then the last category is things that are spicy. And so I have a lot of friends and family who are very into spicy food. And so I hear a lot of, oh, no, it's not spicy. And so to clarify, what I mean by spicy isn't would it make your mouth burn. What I mean is would it hurt if you put it on your eye? And so that's going to be onion, garlic, or hot peppers, or anything else that you would consider spicy, like horseradish, wasabi. And that is because the same kind of skin that's on your eye is the kind of skin that the worms have. So other than those three categories, if it's a plant, it can be composted. It is best to have a standard feeding time, whether that's once a day or once a week, just so that you can have a concept of what is being eaten and what isn't on some sort of regular basis. That's important because you want to make sure that you're not putting in too much food or overfeeding. What I do is I sort of investigate the bin, see what's in there, see if there are, if there's anything uneaten, and then while I'm in there, I sort of push stuff over to one side, add the new food, and then cover it up. That way, any pests wouldn't be able to get to it. And that was one of the strategies that I developed to make sure that flies didn't end up in the system. To speed up feeding, some people will blend their food. Some people will microwave it, bake it. Some people will like freeze it first. I don't do any of those. I put things in whole. I coddle my worms in a number of ways. Blending their food for them is not one of them. The moisture that you're aiming for in your bin is about 70%. And so that moisture is enough that when you feel it, it should feel damp, but you should not be able to squeeze it and get water out. A lot of the food scraps that we put in are going to have water in them. And so a lot of the moisture in your bin will just come from the food scraps. So you don't need to worry about adding moisture, whether that's dumping or spraying. And you should not be dumping water in your worm bin anyways. If it is too dry, you can spray it gradually with a spray bottle and just mix it up, spray it, feel it, let it sit for a little bit, and spray some more. You want to make sure that you don't add too much at any one time, just to make sure that it's soaking in and that you're getting an accurate read on the moisture. If there's too much moisture, that'll be a problem, and that is a bigger problem than if there's too little. So I always err on the side of it being too dry. That would only slow down the worms eating. If it's too wet, it could actually breed bad bacteria and hurt the worms. It can invite pests. It can make everything smelly. It's just not good. Another way that I manage the moisture is I don't always have the lid on the bins. If it seems a little too wet, I'll just leave the lid off. And if it seems too dry, I'll leave the lid on. I do use lids that have holes in them so that air can still get through. But I sometimes just take it all the way off. And then maladies. No one wants things to go bad, but sometimes they do. The two sources of basically anything that can go wrong in your worm bin are overfeeding and having too much moisture, which is why I said it was good to have a consistent time that you are putting food in so you can have an idea of what's being eaten and what's not, so you don't put in more than what they're able to eat. And so the three main things that can go wrong is it can get too acid. And so that is when food gets broken down by bad bacteria. That's often happens because it's too wet or there's too much food. Likely it's a combination. And so if it gets too acidic, it can actually hurt your worms to the point of killing them. It can encourage the bad bacteria to proliferate, and that bad bacteria will smell. That's not fun. And as the bad bacteria are proliferating, as worms are getting hurt, that's going to encourage bugs to move in and start eating what was supposed to be for the worms that they're not able to eat. Bugs will eat and multiply, and you'll have a mess, and you don't want that. So just to say what's going on the screen, the columns are the problems, description of the problem, and then underneath that is the solution. So for acidity, I use eggshells. I add just a teaspoon of eggshells every week as grit for the worms. Worms don't have teeth, sadly. They have gizzards. And so they actually need grit to grind up their food. So I use ground eggshell to be that grit, but also the eggshell acts as a pH buffer. If it were to get too acidic, the eggshells would dissolve a little bit and balance out the acidity and then become inert again. You can use ground oyster shell. The problem with that is eggshells you can get pretty fine. Oyster shells stay pretty coarse. And I did not like having oyster shell at the end when I was trying to sift out the castings. And Tums. Drastic problems call for drastic solutions. Tums is basically just solid basic. You can throw it in, it'll fix it right quick. Smells. No one wants a smelly bin. No one wants a smelly bin in their house. Your bin should not smell. If it smells, there's a problem. So the way to fix that is you can't really, there's probably something else going wrong and you need to address the root problem. That's likely going to be overfeeding or bad bacteria taking over, which would lead back to the acidity or the overfeeding. And then the bugs, we don't want flies. No one wants flies. You should not have flies. To treat the flies themselves, you can use fly treatments. I don't like doing that just because I don't like bringing poison into the space that I'm keeping my beloved worms. But the best way to treat bugs is just to have a pretty regular way of feeding and making sure that you're not feeding too much. If the worms eat quickly. If you feed what the worms can eat, the worms will eat it all up and there'll be nothing for bugs. If you just are very cautious in how often you feed, you should be able to handle that. And then the last step is the most rewarding, that's collecting castings. I have this screen here. It's got 1/8 inch, I measured it the other day. It's got 1/8 inch holes in it. I just fill it up, shake it, and the castings fall through. And on top, I'll still have things that haven't broken down, like stems or avocado peels and adult worms. And so I take those out and I put them back in the bin for the next cycle. And
hey,
I just
AJ?
start filling. Yeah.
Take the screen down again and show us. I mean, take the presentation down and put up the screen.
Oh, sorry. I have this beautiful thing.
There we go.
Yeah. It's an 1/8 inch screen. I just fill it up, shake it, and the castings come out the bottom. And the adult worms and whatnot will stay on top. Like I said, the avocado peel, the stems, larger things like that. Share. Alrighty, sorry about that. And then using castings, well, you want to store them in a container that can breathe. I'll make sure I say that. So what I store castings in are whatever size I'm going to end up selling the castings in, along with holes poked into it, and then I keep them someplace cool. You don't need to, you could stick it in your fridge, that's going to be the best place, but if you just have a cool, dark place, like a corner in your basement, or like a closet that stays pretty reasonably cool, you could keep it there as well.
Hey, AJ, I've got one question already that came in. Do the worm cocoons pass through the mesh?
Yes, they do, sadly.
Okay.
Should I keep my screen up or not at this point?
You could, why don't you leave it up for a little bit so that people can write down your information, and then we can take it down in a little.
Okay. Yeah, so the cocoons will pass through, and that's really sad. So I actually have a double screen process where I screen it once, let everything, the castings and the baby worms fall through, and then I let it sit for a few weeks. And then after that, they should be big enough that when I screen it again, what comes through will be, I should be able to catch more of the worms to try to keep my brood as strong as possible. Oh, Aaron, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Another question then is from Leah. How often do you sift out the castings?
That is a great question. About once a quarter, so 4 times a year.
Okay. From each bin, about once a quarter. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So
okay.
Each bin gets sifted once or 4 times a year.
Okay.
But that also depends. Like let's see. I wait for the castings to get to about this high before I do that, because I don't want to do it more than I have to.
Right.
So, if you are 1 person, 2 person, you could theoretically go longer without needing to empty your castings.
Okay. Kathleen asks, how much do you break down cardboard boxes before using them for bedding?
Oh, about into 3 or 4 inch strips, and then just ripping them up and putting them in.
Okay. And you just do that by hand, or I guess you could cut them, or with a box cutter or something like that, or.
It's fun to just like do that by hand while you're watching Netflix. What else do you have to do?
Oh yes.
This is the worm bin. There's some larger things on top that haven't been broken down. Underneath here is where I fed. So this is an old newspaper. I sort of use that as a barrier, and I fed underneath it. So you can see bits of eggshell. Here's a nice clump of worms around an avocado breaking down.
Nice.
And then the stuff underneath that is this black castings.
Those are the castings. Okay.
Yep.
Cool. And how much longer, or would you still feed that particular bin some?
Oh yeah. That's okay. I'll feed it until it's up to about here.
Okay. Okay.
And I'll give it about 2 weeks. So, like thinking about scales, people and worms think in different scales. What looks to me like the food is all gone does not look like the food is all gone for them. So I leave them for about 2 weeks to eat all the food that I can't see and make sure that it's really thoroughly eaten and refined before I sift it out.
Okay. Okay. So we're getting quite a few more questions here. Let's see. Let me go to one from Jep. He asks, where do you get your starter worms?
That's a great question. I love the current place that I'm getting mine from. It is Texas Worm Farm. I buy them online. They're great. I love it. They are... I've had some terrible experiences in the past with Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. I hope I don't get in trouble. I just got a lot of Indian blue worms, which I was ordering red wigglers. Indian blues work very differently. They have a much lower threshold for what they're comfortable with. So red wigglers will usually not be too traumatized from a trip, and they'll usually settle in pretty nicely to your bin. If you're starting a worm bin, one thing to note is if you're buying them from online, some of them are going to get out. They're going to be like, what is this? I don't know what this is. This isn't my home, and they're going to leave. Red wigglers are pretty calm, and they'll take to their environment pretty easily. Indian blues have a really specific environment that they want, and if that isn't that, they will leave. And so I was getting a lot of worms that weren't what I bought, and then they were, as soon as I would put them into a bin, they would leave and die, and that was just terrible.
Yeah.
Texas Worm Farm was phenomenal. They've just been great to work with, and the worms that I get from them are always great.
Awesome, awesome.
Also, if you're in Goshen, I do sell bins that are just have the bedding and worms ready for people. If you don't want to go through the business of acclimating your worms, the bins that I sell are already acclimated. All you have to do is take it home and start throwing your food in.
Okay, so to that point, here's a small cluster of questions that I think kind of go to that point. So, what kind of bin or container is good for keeping worms? Do there need to be holes on the lid for airflow? And also, does there need to be some holes in the bottom to release liquid?
These are all great questions. Beautiful.
All right.
I'll start with the lid. Yes, the lid needs to have holes if you're going to use a lid. A lot of the times, if the bin's not looking dry, I'll just leave the lid on. If the bin is dry, I will leave the lid on. If the bin looks well hydrated, I'll just leave it off. The lid needs to have holes. I also add additional holes. Let's see. In the side, I don't know. Can you see these holes here?
Yep.
I have some just around the top so that there can be some airflow side to side as well. Holes in the bottom. I started off using a double bin system where there would be one bin and then a barrier for a gap and then another bin underneath it. So there was basically a bin with this gap. And I used holes that would drain out. And this was really close to the beginning of me worm farming. I was having too much moisture. I didn't know what to do. I was probably not. I was making a few errors. One of them was that I was just really resisting using peat moss, so I wasn't using any bedding. And that was making it harder for moisture to evaporate off. And so I finally figured out this bedding combination, and I started using it, and what I realized was that there was no longer anything dripping out of the bottom. The moisture was being held and slowly released at the same speed as the moisture in the food that I was putting in. All that to say, a well-balanced bin should not be making so much liquid that it's oozing out. That does happen. I mean, it was happening to me. So if you are getting going and that is the support you need as you are building your skills for worm keeping, absolutely do it. But as you better understand the worms and feeding and bedding and the whole art of composting, eventually you won't need it.
Okay, great. Lena wants to know, who takes care of the worms when you're on vacation? Uh-oh.
Can you hear me?
Still there, AJ? Still there, AJ?
Unstable internet.
Let's see.
Yes.
Are you still there? Let's see. Having a little bit of difficulty here. Let's see. AJ, can you turn off your video? Let's see. Let's see. Well, we'll see if we can get him back on here. Let's see. Let's see. I think I'm back. So I know that we had a question here from Lou
Am I back?
about, yeah, I hear you anyways. Keep talking, AJ.
Hi, I'm back. Can you
Yeah, all
hear
right.
me?
Yes, yes. Yes. Thanks everybody for hanging out here. Yeah, so the question from Lena was, what happens, who takes care of the worms when you're on vacation?
Oh, very simple. I have no life and I go on no vacations.
Don't go on vacation.
Um,
That's the answer.
yeah. I'll leave the worms alone for one feeding. As long as they've been fed for a few weeks, like I said, there will be bits of food that I think are eaten that the worms don't. So on that end, it is just fine to not let them, or to not feed them for a week. If they were going through some kind of crisis with smell or moisture, I would be really hesitant to leave them alone, just because I would want to be there to monitor and remediate the conditions. But to skip feeding for 1 week is not a problem, as long as as long as the bin isn't empty.
Okay. As long as they've got something to keep them, to tide them over, they're
Yeah.
okay to go a little bit longer. Okay. Here's another question. This is one that came up to me. I've done quite a bit of composting over the years too, and so the question is, do your bins ever overheat? Since composting does generate some heat, and I was wondering about that too.
Yeah, good question. The answer is no. They stay about 4 degrees warmer than their environment, but they don't really get hot. It is in this really weird composting zone where it is a cool composting method, but it's also considered an aerobic composting method, which usually if it's cool, it's anaerobic, and if it's hot, it's aerobic. The bins don't really heat up besides from the natural biological processes that happen to generate some heat.
So is it partly because the medium is loose enough that there's good aerobic penetration and that helps to dissipate the heat? Is that maybe part of it? I don't know.
I have no clue.
Okay.
My guess would be that there's never enough active material at any time to generate a large amount of heat.
Okay.
Things go in, they get eaten, they become pretty inactive after that.
Okay. Good. That's good. Yeah, that was one of my questions too. I for a while I was doing some very interactive composting, and I was measuring the temperature of my compost regularly. Even in the winter, I'd get up over to 100 degrees. But this was a very big pile, so there was a lot of mass there to kind of hold the heat, and you have smaller bins, so that seems like that would probably help to bring the heat down, or to moderate the heat. Let's see. So another question of mine. Let me just look at some of these other questions here to make sure. Another question of mine was, if you get to a smelly bin and you can't fix it, are you then forced to kind of to dump everything out and start over? Do you sift out the worms and stick with them, or do you have to kind of recolonize from some other existing worms that you have?
I'm gonna switch devices for a second. This is,
Sure.
well, do we have the capability of doing that?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if we're able to.
Okay, then I won't do that. Um, so if your bin is just really nasty and let's see, if your bin is really nasty, it could be better to just cut your losses if you have just a goopy hot mess. Um, I mean, some things can be remediated, some can't. I've had things sort of like go black and gross and goopy, and that can't really be fixed. Yeah, can you repeat the question?
Well, I was just asking if you have to, if you get into a situation like that, are you able to salvage any of the worms, or do you have to start over with, by colonizing from some of your other bins or something like that?
Yeah, you should be able to salvage the worms.
Okay.
You just wouldn't be able to salvage any of the matter.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So AJ, we're coming down here about 10 minutes to 1 o'clock. So tell us a little bit more about why you do this. What's the larger? What are you after here? What's this all about?
Yeah. So I started out just trying to reduce my waste. And as I was thinking about it and watching various videos, I started to connect the threads of how it's connected to so many other issues. So like landfills are usually near, we hope that they're not near populations, but when they're near populations, they're near poor populations, they're near populations of color. And we know that as a result then, the air quality goes down, and then the chances of asthma and other health issues go up. So the size of our landfills are having a negative impact on people's health, but specifically on poor and brown people's health. So like having a landfill in itself is a form of violence. And then when we look at our relationship with our food, a lot of the ways that we think about our food is very extraction based. We do something to the land, it gives us value, we extract that value, and it's always this pulling, we take. When we think about composting and returning stuff to the earth, it is about reintegrating, reestablishing this relationship with the earth and living within its cycles. And that concept has been really eroded from degenerative practices. And I say that as a pun. A lot of large-scale agricultural practices lead to fields being eroded. Using worm castings is not going to like stop a field from being eroded. But when we think about composting and our relationship with soil and our relationship with food, and when we can rethink those things, we can rethink our extractive relationships with fields that are leaving them sandy and bare. I was reading an article about the science from basically reinventing worm tea, which is when you use the microbes in castings to colonize a large volume of liquid and then spraying that liquid. They were talking about like this new science of like using this on fields instead of using chemical fertilizer, which is a good thing, but also natural farmers have been doing this forever. This isn't a new technology, and that it was actually being posed as a solution to using anhydrous ammonia, chemical fertilizer, on fields, which often erodes, washes away. There's actually so much washes it away that when it gets into the Mississippi River, it's so concentrated that by the time it enters the Gulf of Mexico, it explodes the growth of algae, creating this huge algal mat that stops light from getting down. And there's this huge dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico because we use so much anhydrous ammonia. And that stops the people who get shrimp there. They can no longer do those economic activities because of what people upstream are doing. So that itself is sort of this violence and this harm. When food goes to the landfill, it breaks down anaerobically, so it breaks down into acid and methane. Neither are things that we want to have around. And we know that healthy soil can actually, when soil is deep and healthy, there are microbes in it that actually feed on methane. So when we have deep, living, rich soil, it can actually act as something sucking the methane out of the air. But when we send food to the landfill, we are pumping methane into the air. So there's this sort of combination of stopping things that are harmful and building things that are life-giving that I find really exciting about vermicomposting, but also being able to share that idea and building momentum and building inspiration. I talk to a lot of folks at the farmers market, and just to see their eyes light up, or to see them learn a little bit more, be a little bit more excited about the food system or sustainable farming or composting. I mean, me having one conversation isn't going to stop climate change, but if I can inspire a few more people to be ready to build a little bit more passion, with more passion, together we could impact climate change. Me and my one worm farm, no, sparks of inspiration and that's all I got.
That's a lot. That's a lot. I see your bandwidth is low. You're breaking up a little bit, AJ.
Oh no.
I mean, we got all that. We got all that. That's great. And that's your passion and your energy and your depth of care comes through really well. So the follow-up question to that is, what do you do with your worm castings then? What happens to them?
So like I said, there's a community compost service. The worm farm is really just a vehicle for the community compost service. So people bring in buckets. Here's an example. They put their food scraps in a bucket, bring it to the farmer's market. I give them an empty bucket, repeat the process ad infinitum. And so part of the castings goes to the people who gave me the food scraps that make the whole system work. Another part of it is sold at the farmer's market, and then the last bit of it is given to Seed to Feed, which is a program in Elkhart that produces local, wholesome,
and in
organic.
Goshen. And in Goshen.
Yes, it is. The program is operated in many places. The fresh food is handed out in Elkhart. And they hand out fresh, local, organic food that's wholesome to folks who would otherwise have trouble accessing fresh food that is healthy and life-giving, that I take for granted that I can access.
All right. AJ, thank you so much for your time and again, your energy, your passion, your knowledge. Thank you for sharing it with all of us. This has been really interesting, and I hope that others who have been here with us today are able to follow up with you either directly or through us here at the Department of Environmental Resilience. Next week, we will have Annette Webb with us, who has also been a vermicomposter. She's going to be talking to us about gardening, about kind of the next step. Here's the soil that you're tending, you're caring for. How do you encourage the soil to bring forth good things to eat? And that's also at the heart of what you've been working at, AJ. So I hope everybody can tune in again next week. Again, once more, AJ, thank you so much Any parting words of wisdom or a last pun or something? Put you on the
One of
spot.
my favorite phrases to use is decomposition is a science, but composting is an art.
I like it. I like it. I love it. That's a great way to close. Thank you, AJ. Everybody, be
All right.
well.
Thanks for
be
having me.
safe. Yeah. And we'll look forward to seeing you all next week.